my name is Daniel James Sharp. I'm the editor of the Freethinker, and today I am joined by Gavin Evans, journalist and author of various books, most recently Bible Stories, Fact, Fiction, and Fantasy in Scripture, which we shall be discussing today. So, hello, Gavin, and thanks for joining me.
Oh, hello, Daniel. Really nice to meet you.
I suppose the best place to start would be with you. You go into your background a bit in the book, your religious upbringing and your doubts and your eventual atheism. So I thought you might like to talk about that a little bit and how that led you to write this book and what the book is about. What's the purpose of the book? That's a lot of
Okay.
questions in
Yeah,
one.
that's quite a lot of questions. I'll try and congeal it into one answer. Okay, so I grew up in this evangelical, born again, talking in tongues family. My father was Jewish, but was converted in his early 20s. And he eventually became an evangelical Anglican minister and later a bishop. So I was brought up in this kind of fundamentalist faith, and was part of that. So when I was 8, I, as it was put then, accepted the Lord Jesus Christ as my personal savior and was born again. It didn't do anything to me emotionally, but it was, I felt I was now, on my way to heaven, with just a little bit of life in between. And when I was 13, I was at a kind of a Jesus people meeting and was invited to talk in tongues. So that was part of my upbringing. On the other hand, my father, with his 3 children, imparted to us a lot of his Jewish upbringing. I mean, not just the Yiddish phrases and so on, but also the sense of being part of the chosen people and so on. So there were those two elements. And as I was growing up, I had, in my teen years, a lot of conflict with my father, sometimes physical conflict. And when I was 17, I went for a year to Texas as an exchange student. And while in the airplane, I decided that this is it. I'm going to break. I was already having residual doubts, and I'm going to kind of break for it for a year. I'm going to have a year off, God. And then suddenly it was a bit like the scales came off my eyes, and I could, and suddenly all these lurking questions relating to my faith and frankly the absurdity of it began to kind of settle in my brain. And by the time the plane landed, I was an agnostic, and then the next decade or so, my agnosticism became, the doubt became more about any kind of spiritual element, became more and more pronounced, until eventually I reached a point where I realized I actually don't believe, and I'm convinced that there is nothing more out there than what's inside of us, and so I became an atheist. But I retained my deep interest in the history of religion, but particularly of the Abrahamic faiths. I mean, the ones I'd grown up with Christianity, but also had been quite a lot exposed to Judaism through family members, and had, been to bar mitzvahs and so on. So I had some exposure to that as well. And then later I'd been to mosques a few times with friends and so on. And then eventually I read the Quran, cover to cover, and got a real sense of that. So with each of the Abrahamic religions, I kind of immersed myself. After my father died, I in a way became even more interested in that history. And then during COVID, I went down a rabbit hole, which I tend to do, which is why each of my books have found me going down rabbit holes of particular interests. And in this case, it was looking at the history of these religions, of the Abrahamic religions. And I read, I read a huge amount: books, academic articles, journalistic articles, speaking to people. So I immersed myself in that material. And then this book is a result. In fact, initially what I did was I kind of mixed it with memoir. And my wife, who's an author, Margie Author, she read it and she said, these are two books. So the memoir was published a little bit earlier. It was called Son of a Preacher Man. And this book is on my research.
Yeah, I was going to mention the memoir actually, which I haven't read, but I'd be quite interested in reading. It looks very interesting, because it did seem that this was, at least at the beginning, it's quite a personal book. So I can certainly see why it started being mixed in with the memoir.
Yeah, but I separated that. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just the forwards in the first person voice.
Yeah.
The rest of it, I've extracted myself from
Yes,
that
yeah.
because I just thought it was better to do it that way.
But that frames it quite interestingly, I think.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, is there any particular reason why you went back to thinking about religion, talking about religion, or was it just a rabbit hole? Because your earlier books were more about race and race science, and so it's a bit removed from that, perhaps.
Well, that's not so much, because these were all part of my upbringing. I mean, growing up in apartheid South Africa, one is so exposed to racism. So that was what inspired me to, in a way, to dig into that. But a big part of my upbringing was that immersion into faith. And I guess when one reaches a certain age, one starts to look inwards and look at what things formed you, and what are those ideas that formed your perceptions of the world. And that was what the one thing was the racism of apartheid, but the other thing was this kind of religious faith. And so that's what inspired me to go back into it, to look at the ideas that formed who I was, or who I am.
And well, I mean, I've found the book, it's a really good sort of synthesis of all of this research that you've done, and it's very wide ranging and very interesting, and it goes into such a huge amount in such an accessible way, that I highly recommend it to anyone. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what were the most interesting parts of it for you, because you go into the Old and New Testaments and their formation, and ideas of heaven and hell, and the formation of Trinitarianism, and so much else. And and actually, just on the back of that, what did you leave out? Because I imagine there was a lot that you might have wanted to include, but
yeah, I mean, there's so much. Obviously, you've got to keep it to a certain length. So there is. I mean, the areas I could have explored in much more depth. But the things that really they didn't surprise me. But when I read the Old Testament again after several years of not having anything to do with the Bible, when I read it again, I was actually, the first time I read it again, I mean, I've obviously read it again subsequently, was when I was in a prison cell. I was detained, without trial, in South Africa in the mid 1980s, and so I read and it was clearly, the Old Testament was clearly mythological, and because I then, but more later, had dug into the Odyssey and the Iliad, it resembled the writing of that, the magic that is so much part of the Old Testament. This magical God who initially in the beginning of Genesis The first version, he creates the heavens and the earth, and he's this kind of omnipotent God. In the second chapter, it's a different God. Actually, the one is the second one is Yahweh, and the first one, which was written later, is Elohim. And the second God is a very human God, like the kind of gods of ancient Greece. He walks in the Garden of Eden, and he creates Eve out of the rib of Adam, and so on. So it's two distinct stories. And then the magic just starts flowing. I mean, the Leviathans. There are the God can divide the sea. He can stop the sun going around the earth. For Joshua. There's a behemoth. There are all sorts of the kind of magic that is in the Odyssey, is also in the Old Testament. So that was one thing that interested me when I read it again, was just how magical and mythological it was. And then when I looked at the archaeology, and there's been some wonderful work in Israel, particularly in Tel Aviv, on digging into the archaeology of the Old Testament. And it's pretty clear Moses didn't exist. It's also pretty clear there was never an exodus from Egypt. The Hebrews were not enslaved in Egypt. They were a Canaanite people. And the stories that emerged of Joshua's destruction, which if you read the Old Testament, it feels like, I mean, ethnic cleansing or genocide on a large scale, but it didn't actually happen. It was written hundreds and hundreds of years later, but referring to an earlier period where there were destructions of cities throughout that area, about 1200, 1300 BC, in all over, in Anatolia, in that whole area. There were just collapses of cities. It seemed to have been a domino effect, and languages, or at least the written languages, writing disappeared for a while, for a few hundred years, and then they start to re-emerge. These Canaanite cities start re-emerging, and that is where what became the Israelites came from, as well as the Philistines and so on. They were all part of that Canaanite community. So that interested me, that the patriarchs were mythological. And there's not much doubt about that. Where there is doubt is on how much about David and Solomon was real. I mean, there's only one tiny reference to outside of the Bible to David. There's a stele, which has a reference to House of David from about I think about 800 BCE, and that's it. Nothing on Solomon. But from that, people presume that David probably did exist, but it would have been a warlord, because the Jerusalem from the period of David, which is about 1000 BCE, was a very small village with probably fewer than 1,000 people. So the idea of Solomon's temple was thrown into doubt, and of course they haven't been able to find Solomon's temple. And the view is that it was built much later, by King Josiah, which was in the 7th century. So that history was very interesting. And then the other thing that really fascinated me was looking at the Jesus story. Now, I always assumed that Jesus was an historical figure. I'm not convinced that he wasn't. I'm just not convinced that he was either. Because when you break down the evidence, so first of all, if you look at non-Christian sources, there's nothing, nada. Christians claim 3 sources. Their best one is Josephus, who was writing at the end of the 1st century, and was a kind of Romanized Jew who wrote histories and so on, and he refers to Jesus in two passages. One is certainly fraudulent. The other, there's various views on it, but the fraudulent one was inserted later. It doesn't mean anything because he was writing at the end of the 1st century, and his information clearly, some of it's wrong. He gets things about Pontius Pilate wrong. He clearly was just going from talking to Christians at that time. So there's no evidence, contemporary evidence of Jesus' existence from non-Christian sources, nothing. Then you get the Gospels. Now, the Gospels, of course, are full of Jesus, but they're also full of miracles and magic. Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus is crucified, the people from the graves rise from the dead and wander around in Jerusalem. And there are people in the Gospels who are raised from the dead in both Mark and John, and so on. So unless you believe in magic, then you have to accept that a lot of that's mythological. And then you think, well, how can you separate the mythology from the history? And it's very difficult, especially considering when the Gospels were written. The first was written in about 75 AD or CE. That was Mark's Gospel, but bits of it were written later. In the case of Mark's Gospel, possibly as late as the 4th century, the last bit. Then you get Matthew's Gospel, written probably about 85 CE, but not all of it. The story of Jesus's birth and Mary were inserted later. They're 2nd century, and other bits as well. Luke again, Luke about 90 CE, but there are bits of Luke which were added later, including his birth story. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added, by the way, in the end of the 2nd century. So we don't know who wrote those books. And then John is a pastiche of lots of writers. And John and Mark make no reference to the virgin birth or anything like that at all. So when you look at them as a whole, you see that it's very, very difficult to extract. Well, how do they know that when they were written 45 to 60 years after Jesus's, or 70 years after Jesus's supposed execution, did people have very long memories of his words? No. Mark borrowed from Paul and sort of riffs on Paul's stories in his letters. Then Matthew borrows from Mark. Luke borrows from both Mark and Matthew. And John borrows a bit from Luke and Mark, but goes in his own way completely. So there's nothing reliable there that we can say, well, that is history. And the Bible scholars or who've tried to do that have these criteria of authenticity. And what I did was I went and spoke to other historians of the ancient world, leading historians of the ancient world, and I put to them, do you use these criteria of authenticity? Like, this sounds likely. He wouldn't have said this because it goes against the grain, so it must be true. And they just laughed and they said, no, only biblical scholars do that. We don't take that kind of thing seriously. So in the realm of biblical scholarship, it's a bit dodgy. And basically, if you argue that Jesus might not have existed, you're not going to get a 10-year job in that realm. So I just think there's nothing in the Gospels that we can rely on. So all you've got is Paul's letters. Now, half of the Paul's letters were written not by Paul. They were written mainly in the 2nd century. Some of them, like Timothy, as late as 140, 150 CE. But the genuine letters also got bits in them which were not real. There's an anti-Semitic bit in one of the letters which was clearly comes from a later period. So they're pastiches as well, but most people think though at least those 7 are genuine. But he makes very little reference to the living Jesus. His only references are that he had the seed of David, and that he was born of a woman, and that he was crucified. That's it. None of the stories that are in the Gospels, the miracles, the parables, and the healings, and anything like that, nothing in Paul. He clearly didn't know any about that. You would think that he was writing for churches. He would and he would use examples from the life of Jesus if he knew about it. So we can assume that he didn't know about it. So it leaves very little that shows that he really was an historical being. And there are some scholars who doubt that, who say that he might have started off as in mythology, and then been historicized by later writers, a bit like the story of Romulus. Romulus started off as, well, the son of Mars, and a Vestal virgin, so entirely a mythological figure, but then later gets historicized as the founder of Rome. And so there is a view that that could be the case. Now, I'm not convinced. I don't come to a conclusion on that because I don't think we can. I mean, it's quite possible also that he was an historical figure, but we know very little about him. And if he lived in roughly the time that is assumed, which is be about kind of from about 3 BCE to about 27, maybe 30 CE, that he could have got under the noses of the Romans for some reason. He could have been a preacher of some kind, and that's about as much as we can say about him. I mean, he might have had a mother called Mariam, but really, I think even that is a guess. So I'm just I'm agnostic on whether Jesus did exist or not. But I think if he did, we know next to nothing about him. Yeah, sorry, a very long answer.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, I mean that's exactly the word I would tend to use about that particular question, agnostic. Yeah, it is interesting that you do have a growing and mythicist cadre of scholars, where once they would have been dismissed out of hand, they seem to have a lot more credibility these days. But I think I'd probably still come down on the agnostic. I was going to say agnostic side of the question, but the middle of the question then.
Yeah. I find the writing of the Christ myth people very interesting, and particularly Richard Carrier. And I think he's a very thorough scholar. I'm not completely convinced by his conclusion, but I do think he puts forward a good argument. And the people who rail against him, it's kind of like, well, he's a minority. Well, minorities are sometimes proved to be right. So I probably have the same view as you, sort of agnostic about it. Yes.
And well, since we're cycling through the 3 monotheisms, let's jump forward a little bit to Islam. Then you have a chapter on Islam, on the Quran, and it's interesting because that seems to be a slightly different sort of, or is it that different? Because these, the texts were compiled after the fact, and then they became canonized and reified, if you like. So yeah, I just wonder if you'd like to talk about that and the similarities and differences between the formations of these different faiths.
I had some. I toyed with the idea of whether I should include a chapter on Islam, but when I read the Quran again, I was so interested in how much influence the Bible, the apocryphal Gospels who never made the Bible, and in particular the Old Testament had on the Quran. It feels like when you read it, all the characters from the Old Testament are in the Quran, and they've got basically the same names. The stories about them are very, very similar to those in the Old Testament. There's much more, or considerable amount more, on Mary in the Quran than there is in the Bible, and that's because of one of the earlier chapters I've got is looking at the history of Mary, and her story grows and grows after the end of the 1st century CE. So by the time the Quran was written, she had become a kind of huge figure in Christianity, and that is reflected in the Quran. Also, some of the apocryphal Gospels, the ones that didn't make the cut, you can see the influence of the stories in the Gospel of James, which kind of has got a lot more on Mary. Those stories go into the Quran, and there's a wonderful gospel called it's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It's one of my favorites. It's basically Jesus starts off as the Harry Potter villain, but instead of Tom Riddle, but instead of turning into Voldemort, he turns into the Messiah. And so he's like a real bad little dude. And he, whenever anybody bumps him or anything like that, he just like casts a spell on them and they die, or he makes them blind or whatever. But then then through the influence of elders and that, he becomes good, and then he kills everybody he's killed. And but anyway, one of the lovely little stories in that gospel is how he creates a bird from clay, and that story is repeated almost word for word in the Quran. So you can see its influences, and that interested me. Also, I think that a lot of people who rail against the Quran clearly haven't read it. I mean, if you want to look at bad treatment of women, I mean, my gosh, you just go through the Old Testament, and it's the Quran in relative terms comes out quite well. I mean, it's how to sell your daughter to slavery, and on sons, if your son is badly behaved, take him to the town gate and get the locals to stone him to death. I mean, it goes on and on. There was also that aspect of things which I wanted to examine. So that's why I did a chapter on the Quran. I mean, I'm sure lots of people, as with the other chapters, are not going to be delighted with it, but yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say if it's women's rights you're after, then I don't think any of the holy texts
none
really
of them
going to
are
help you out one way or another.
One way or another, you're going to get it's bad. They're all bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, pardon me, I got a tickly throat. Part of the point of the book as well is to discuss how all this affects us today. They're not just stories, mythological stories belonging to the past. They're very much alive, for better and for worse. But your particular focus is Protestant evangelicalism, fundamentalism. You also go in, and this is timely again, to the relationship between Christian and Jewish Zionisms. And you note the influence of the Christian nationalist right in the elections of Donald Trump. And how that's all becoming rather scary.
It certainly is, yeah.
So how do you think? I mean, how do you think an intervention such as this book will impact those things, if at all? I mean, but
Yeah, I think if
would
it
you
all,
hope? How would you hope it would
yeah,
change
if
things?
if it all is probably opposite. I would hope that some people will read it, um, almost despite themselves, and will be convinced by at least some of the argument, at least enough to put doubt um, in their mind, and to see the Bible as a pastiche of myths with little bits of history dotted in, rather than as the kind of divine work of God. So I would hope that, and I would hope that it challenges people around the ideas of faith, because I think some of those ideas, particularly the evangelical ones, and the way the particular growth of evangelicalism in the United States over the last few decades. I mean, there is a dangerous element to that. And so I've got a couple of chapters on that. The one is looking at Christian Zionism. I look at both Zionisms together. And another, because the idea that I mean, Christian Zionism comes from the idea that there's going to be this kind of tribulation where the world is going to get all sort of churned up, and then the faithful are going to go and float up to heaven, which is called the rapture, and everybody else is going to be left behind for 7 horrible years.
Which was meant to happen recently, wasn't it? Again,
yeah. Well, it's always meant to happen. They always new dates for this one. And then there's going to be Armageddon, which is the war taking place in Israel. Some of the views is that the Solomon's temple, mythological temple, has to be rebuilt, which would be on the Dome on the Rock. And then there's going to be this war, and then God's going to send huge boulders, hailstone boulders on people's heads, and then finally Jesus is going to come in, descend with his saints, defeat the Antichrist, and rule with a rod of iron for the next 1,000 years. That's Christian Zionism in essence. So that view is very prevalent, particularly in the United States, but it's as with most things, it has spread much more widely than just America, and it's kind of gone along with the rise of Pentecostalism over the last about 120 years. So this idea that the gifts of the Spirit that are described in Acts are still available to people. So talking in tongues, divine healings, casting out demons, that is very much the stuff of Pentecostalism. This idea that you're not only baptized and accept the Lord as your personal savior, but then there's another step where you get baptized in the Spirit. And then you overflow with the Holy Spirit, and these gifts come. And that view, and this premillennial view of the rapture, the tribulation, the Antichrist, the second coming, is all part of a package of contemporary evangelical Christianity, particularly in the United States, but as I said, much wider than that now.
And well, it's perhaps a slightly obvious question, but what's the danger of this view? I mean, it's hugely influential, as you say, and it does have a real impact on the world stage. I think I recently interviewed James Bloodworth on a different subject, the manosphere.
Oh yeah.
He, in his book on the subject, he includes a quote from C.S. Lewis at the beginning, only by being terrible do they avoid being comic, because if they weren't so dangerous and influential, they would be laughable. But unfortunately, we can't really laugh at them.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of the danger is that the Christian right has latched itself to the kind of extremes of MAGA, and has seen Trump as as the kind of a savior figure, and they justify how somebody who can talk about pussy grabbing could be the answer to their prayers, and they use the story of King Cyrus, who was the Mesopotamian or Babylonian leader, who let the Jews free, so to return to to Jerusalem. And so, if God could use a kind of Babylonian dictator, he can use Trump as well. And then they feel, well, he's done God's work by changing the abortion laws, by eliminating ideas that they don't agree with. So I think that kind of marriage, on the one hand, between fundamentalist Christianity and the kind of MAGA right, is one issue, and then on the other hand, the marriage between the kind of Christian Zionism, which comes with it, and the more extreme versions of Zionism in Israel, of the idea that the mythical united kingdom of King David, which didn't actually exist, needs to come back. So that means Judea and Samaria, as they call it, the West Bank, as we call it, needs to be part of a united Israel for the Jewish people. And that idea, and the idea that the return of the Jewish people was part of the package that leads to the second coming. So in that way, I mean, the Christian fundamentalists have allied themselves with the kind of far right in the United States, but also the far right in Israel. And I mean, we can see the problems that has created. I mean, particularly what is happening in the West Bank now. I mean, there are many Christians, thousands of Christians, who, just like the Muslims in that area, are being just removed from their homes in the West Bank by settlers who take that view, and they have the full support of most of the Christian fundamentalists.
Without getting into the weeds too much on it, but just wonder what you make of the recent developments in Israel over Gaza, the Donald Trump's grand peace initiative for the Middle East.
Well, I'm just waiting and watching. I mean, I'm trying to be hopeful that it will lead to at least a period of peace. But I mean, I think there is the idea of it now of it's a bit off the subject, but of a two-state solution, when half of the land of the West Bank is controlled by settlers, is very difficult to envisage how that can work. And I mean, the alternative, or an alternative view, is that the whole area should be one secular democratic state, in which, if there is a right to return, it should be extended to Palestinians. But of course, that's not an idea that has any traction. But it's hard to see how even a two-state solution can be successful. So, and if there's not a two-state solution, or the whole area doesn't become a secular democratic state, which is not going to come, it's very hard to see how peace can be maintained there. But I'm trying to be hopeful about it. Yeah.
No. I don't know how familiar you are with. Well, I know that you mentioned the historian Tom Holland in your book on his theory about Islam's origins.
Mm.
But I wondered if you were familiar with his book Dominion, in which he argues for Christianity being the foundation of the Western world, and that we are marinated in Christianity, whether we're believers or not. I call it, in distinction to the new atheists who you also discuss, I call this the sort of new theism. It's not even a religious or theological argument so much as a historical and political one. And it seems to be quite popular among a growing number of people that we need religion, Christianity in particular, to have safe and stable societies and protect our societies, the Western world, against whatever enemy you care to name, wokeism or China or whatever it may be. And they're not, a lot. This comes in different varieties, different flavors, and it's not necessarily fundamentalist. But it does seem to me it does give some succor to the fundamentalist idea, to religious literalism. Because they, proper apologists of religion, would really love to take that thesis and to champion it as proof that we need Christianity in our societies.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't, as an atheist, I don't accept that, and I don't accept that historically the record of Christianity is one that should delight people. I mean, I do give a little bit of some of the record of Christianity over the past 2,000 years, and it's a pretty awful record. So the idea that it was a civilizing force that brought good, I have my doubts. I mean, I'm not someone who feels that Christianity is all bad. I mean, I think that there's particularly over the last 250 years, say, I think that Christianity has often been on the side of the angels. I mean, there were Christians who campaigned against slavery. There are Christians who've done immense amount of charitable work. In fact, I mean, not just Christians, but Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, a great deal of the world, some people say the most of it, of charitable giving comes from people who are either part of those their faith groups, or from the churches, mosques, temples themselves. So I mean, I do see that Christianity has and other religions have given people a lot, but the idea that Western civilization is better for it, no, I don't. I think that is both historically wrong, but also just conceptually wrong. The idea that a belief or belief system or faith system or an organized religion is what brings about order in society, if it's order that one's looking for, is dubious, I think.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, it's just a bit of a bugbear of mine, this new theism stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, because for Tom Holland, it seems that pretty much everything, especially the good things about Western civilization, are ultimately founded on Christianity in some way, shape, or form, which I just think is an untenable hypothesis. But moving from the new theists to the new atheists, you devote some time in your last chapter to discussing Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. This is where you lose me a little bit. I think I would consider myself a new atheist of sorts. Okay. So I do have some disagreements with parts of your final chapter, but I thought it was very interesting nonetheless. And I did want to ask why you decided to focus on them, because a lot of the time, I mean, I can't count the number of articles in the last decade or so that that start with the words "the new atheism is dead." Um,
Yeah, yeah.
as people say, well, it's that was a thing back in the 2000s. But we don't really care about that anymore, whether we're atheists or not. Um, so just I wondered why the focus on that.
Okay, so the reason I focused on them was because the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they call themselves, I quite like that. Um, uh, um, they railed against religion, and they each of the four produced these books. Now, of the four books, the one I liked the best was Christopher Hitchens's book, and I think that he, for one thing, knows more about Islam than any of the others. He's clearly actually had, I mean, he's dead now, but he'd actually clearly read the Quran. I didn't agree entirely. I think there's a lot, much more debate within Islam than he acknowledged or realized. So I mean, I critiqued him maybe on a more esoteric point, um, which related to he spread himself too thinly and didn't really know much about biology, which he wrote about in a part of the book, but it wasn't the essence of that book. Dawkins, I was more critical of, and am more critical of. I mean, it's not just the kind of tweets he makes on Islam, but I think his idea of religion being a meme is bonkers. I think the idea of thoughts, of ideology, of culture as little units, gene-like units, is a particularly silly idea. I mean, memes don't exist, genes do. And so seeing and Daniel Dennett, who always kind of followed in Dawkins's wake, also took up that that idea. So I think that what Dennett, but also Dawkins do is they tend to, not absolutely, but they tend to conflate theism and creationism. There's often, in the way they write about it, there's a kind of, as if there's a continuum between them. But I think, I mean, within Christianity, there's a sharp divide between people who are biblical literalists who believe the world was created 6,000 years ago, and those who think of as years, as just periods of time, and who accept evolution and so on, which most of the church, including the Pope, believe. So there are real differences which within religion, but I don't think they understand the enemy that they're talking about. They really don't understand any of them. But Hitchens was closest to it, to understanding it. But any of them really understand what it is that drives people to be religious. What gives people faith? Why people believe? Why people have the community of the church? They don't address those things because it's not part of their gaze. I mean, the one I'm most critical of is Sam Harris, who I don't think intellectually is up to the other three in any sense. I mean, he's become an advocate for a form of race science, which I think is pretty despicable. But of the other three, I think there's a flaw in that. I don't think they understand religion, because I don't think they understand what it is that drives people to see them. And when you're trying to see religion and religious faith as a meme, in Dawkins' case, one that he mixes that with the idea that religious belief is something that evolved biologically. I think you just way off the mark. I like Dawkins a lot on some of his arguments for atheism. I like what he wrote about the kind of criticism of that some deists have of, well, we can't explain this or that in the world out there, therefore we've got to put God of the gaps. I mean, and he demolishes that very effectively. And I think some of his explanations in terms of in terms of why the world evolved so perfectly, because tiny little incremental improvements, whether it's through natural selection or on a much bigger scale, that idea and the way he wrote about it appealed to me. So I'm not condemning all of them, but I just think they don't, that they're often missing the point.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, but I don't think that's entirely fair.
Okay. Okay.
If you don't mind me.
No, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the reasons why people believe and what draws them to religion, I think there's a wonderful early part of the God delusion, for example, called A Deeply Religious Non-Believer, where Dawkins extols the awe impulse, if you like, and says, he talks about, I think, a teacher who was so overawed by the beauty of nature and complexity of nature that it led him to become a priest or some sort of cleric or theologian, perhaps. And then Dawkins says, that could easily have been me. I have those feelings. I understand those feelings. And Hitchens also, you give that great quote by Marx about the opiate of the people, which is actually a much more subtle quote than it seems in its entirety. But Hitchens he quotes that as well in his book. Makes a point of.
I'd forgotten that. Okay, yeah.
So I mean, yeah, I mean, it's something we could
yes
hash back and forth, but I think maybe a tad unfair.
Okay,
but,
no, fair enough.
But I think you make important points, and
yeah.
As I said, I enjoyed with it, and it's good to be stimulated into disagreement in any case by a book.
Just on why is one of the reasons I that Hitchens' book I thought was better than the others in many ways is that he's so even-handed about his condemnation of religion, because he doesn't just go for the Abrahamic religions. He goes for Hinduism. He goes for he goes for Buddhism, and I mean, he was Jewish, but he goes for circumcision. He doesn't. I thought he was very even-handed in the way he treated religion, and I like that.
You kind of do the same yourself in a way, even though you're focused more on the Abrahamics, but you do take the time to explore them fairly and in depth. And you even talk a little bit about Modi and Hindu nationalism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, as I said, I recommend the book very much.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, I'm sure we could go back and forth on that part alone for a long time.
Absolutely.
But,
yes.
But I don't know if there's anything else you might like to say, because I know we're coming up for an hour. Anything that I might have asked or that you wanted to.
Just the one thing. I mean, as you say, my focus was on kind of evangelical Protestantism, but I do have 2 chapters on 2 Marys, and I found the Mary story so interesting, because she starts off as very little. I mean, she's not in Mark, except, I mean, there's no virgin birth in Mark. There's just like a little reference to her being worried that her son is is not doing is getting above himself, kind of thing. That's it, and then that's kind of developed in Matthew, and there's no virgin birth there, but that arrives in the 2nd century, and then gradually it grows. I mean, I love the idea of the way, but it fascinates me how this myth about Mary became necessary for the culture of the time. So she early in the 2nd century, the virgin birth idea comes, because that's seen as necessary by both Matthew and Luke. Then later, when the Gospel of James, which is not in the apocryphal gospel, comes, she becomes a perpetual virgin, and this idea that she gave birth as a virgin, but then she remained a virgin because Joseph wasn't interested in sex. So the perpetual virgin idea starts to develop, and then gradually she gets more and more assets. So she becomes this figure who was sinless herself, and then she couldn't have died, like become an old lady, because so she ascends to heaven, and then she becomes the queen of heaven. And so her legend kind of grows and grows within the Catholic Church in particular, but also the kind of Coptic and Orthodox churches. And then the Protestants come and they say, well, those are not in the Bible, and we stick to the Gospels. So she stops at Mark and at Matthew and Luke. That's as far as we go. So she's no longer a perpetual virgin, because Matthew says she has. They all say she has other children, and she didn't have marital relations with Joseph until after Jesus was born in Matthew. So she's none of those things. So the Protestants kind of pare it back. And that was the one story. And then there's another chapter on the other Mary, which is Mary Magdalene. So we have the story like in Jesus Christ Superstar, where she's this kind of harlot who is in love with Jesus. And in the Da Vinci Code, she's there as well. So what it is really they've conflated Mary Magdalene, who's this minor character, with Mary of Bethany, who's a completely separate character, and they've made them into one. And there's one little bit that the woman who anointed Jesus with expensive perfumes was a sinner. So obviously a sinner must be a prostitute. So they decide that this sinner and Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene are all one, and they merge into this much bigger character. So anyway, those chapters it was interesting to me how these ideas developed over a few hundred years and then kind of got consolidated within the church. And so many theologies are like that. I mean, the idea of the Holy Trinity, which we think of as an essential part of Christianity, it only really starts to emerge in the 3rd century. There's nothing of the Holy Trinity in Paul's letters or in any of the Gospels. So it's part of the fascination for me of reading this stuff was how these ideas developed over time and then got consolidated at particular points.
Yeah, I should have said that actually. That's the 3 Marys. All of that was really interesting. So was the development of Satan / devil / Lucifer.
Oh yeah. Satan. Oh my God. Yeah, that's another one. Yeah, because in the Old Testament there's no Satan. There's the Satan, lowercase, and he's kind of God's advocate. He walks around with these kind of holy figures in Job, and then goes and reports back to God, and he's the Satan. Then there's Lucifer, which is only in Isaiah, and it's clearly metaphorical. They're talking about Lucifer, which is Venus, and rising and falling, and it's talking about a bad king, and the bad king is going to rise, but he's going to fall. The prophet says That's Lucifer. And then the devil, which comes from the kind of Zoroastrian religion, because you've got good and evil in the Zoroastrian religion, and they all emerge, or they all merge into Satan in the New Testament. As you get on in the New Testament, Satan becomes a bigger kind of a bigger figure, and I mean the same with hell and heaven. I mean, heaven was for the gods in the Old Testament. And even in the New Testament with Paul, the future is going to be a paradise on earth, but heaven up there is for the gods, and there are layers of heaven. I mean, Paul says he gets sent to the third heaven to get instructed by Jesus, and hell. There's no hell in the Old Testament, and very little in the New Testament. These are all ideas that developed later. In the 2nd, 3rd century, they start this idea of hell, and a lot of it drawn from Greek mythology as well.
I think the metaphor you use, or the image you use when you're talking about the Jesus story, is of a pearl or an oyster. Pearl, an oyster pearl that gets encrusted over time and layers on top of it. Yeah, and it's interesting actually as well, just that the Quran is much more descriptive about heaven and hell, and perhaps it's because that by that time those stories had grown.
Yes, yeah, they had. By the 6th, 7th century, those ideas were kind of well formed of a terrible fiery place called hell, and this wonderful kind of paradise in the sky called heaven. So those are part of the Quran in much more pronounced way than in the Bible.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it then, and I just want to say thank you again for taking the time and to reiterate my recommendation of the book, which is very good.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Daniel. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks.